They called it the soft underbelly of Europe, a phrase coined by Winston Churchill, meant to imply a relatively easy route into the continent after the grinding battles of North Africa. But there was nothing soft about the beaches of Sicily in July 1943. The heat was a physical enemy, a suffocating blanket woven from volcanic sand and Mediterranean humidity. The sand itself was burning, radiating the morning sun back up into the faces of the assaulting troops. The air, already thick with the smell of cordite, the sharp metallic scent of expended gunpowder, and briny salt, felt heavy enough to choke on. The men of the 3rd Infantry Division, America's Rock of the Marne, were not advancing, they were pinned down. Operation Husky, the largest amphibious assault in history to date, was, in the history books, a glorious tale of generals. It is the story of Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., a man who believed in the doctrine of speed and audacity, racing his American 7th Army toward Palermo and then Messina. It is the story of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the meticulous British commander, methodically pushing his 8th Army up the coastal road. It is a narrative of strategic maps drawn in North African villas, of the deployment of armored divisions, and of the grand, inescapable calculus that marked the beginning of the end for the Axis powers in Italy. But down on the ground, in the chaos of the landing zone near Licata, where the surf met the Italian coast, history was being made by a soldier who carried no M1 Garand rifle, who wore no steel helmet to deflect shrapnel, and who held no military rank, not even that of private. He was a creature of instinct and fierce, trained loyalty. He was a tapestry of genetic traits, a mix of German Shepherd, whose lineage traced back to disciplined police dogs, Collie, with its innate herding intelligence and striking protective instincts, and Husky, a dash of Arctic endurance and stubborn will. His name, a moniker of simplicity that belied his complexity, was Chips. And on that day, amid the relentless chatter of German MG-42 machine gun fire that was systematically tearing the beach apart, scattering sand and flesh alike, Chips did something that no human soldier, driven like courage or fear, could quite comprehend. He didn't merely survive the kill zone by digging a shallow scrape in the sand. He attacked the source of it. This was not a moment of confused panic. It was a calculated, albeit canine, charge. The story of Chips is often dismissed by the cynic as a sentimental war story, something fit for a children's book. But this is not a cartoon narrative where the hero wears a cape. This is not a fable about a beloved, gentle mascot offering comfort to weary men. This is the stark, true history of a highly trained biological weapon, a living, breathing, 80-pound instrument of war. He was a creature taken from a quiet backyard in Pleasantville, New York, stripped of his domestic suburban life and meticulously reprogrammed for the primal necessities of combat. His is the story of the only American soldier in that brutal conflict to be officially recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and the Purple Heart, only to have his own government, the very entity he served, strip those honors all away. The justification was nothing more than a bureaucratic, lifeless technicality contained in an obscure military rulebook. Equipment cannot be decorated. To truly grasp the essence of the Second World War, historians and readers invariably look at the men who fought it, the farm boys, the factory workers, the college students who were conscripted and trained. We seek their diaries, their letters, their memoirs to understand the sacrifice, but sometimes to see the true, unvarnished cost of loyalty and the raw, uncomplicated nature of courage, you have to look lower. You have to look at the ones who didn't raise their hand and take an oath, the ones who didn't volunteer for the draft, the ones who were simply and tragically donated. They were the silent four-legged soldiers of the Canine Corps, and Chips was their defiant symbol. To understand the transformation of Chips, you must first comprehend the sheer, overwhelming desperation that gripped the United States in the year 1942. The country, reeling from the sudden, devastating blow of the attack on Pearl Harbor, had been thrown into the global conflagration. The mighty American military machine, though awakening, was scrambling to catch up to the seasoned, battle-hardened forces of the Axis. The nation needed steel for ships, rubber for tires and tanks, men for the front lines, and, in a logistical twist, they needed dogs. The Quartermaster Corps, the branch of the Army responsible for supplying and transporting troops, equipment, and animals, quickly estimated that the expanding military needed
thousands of dogs. These animals were not for simple companionship, they were indispensable assets. They were required for sentry duty around critical facilities, for the dangerous work of messenger service between combat units under fire, and for perimeter patrols in the dark of night, where their acute senses could detect an enemy infiltration far sooner than any human guard. But the United States, unlike Germany or the Soviet Union, did not possess a massive standing canine army. They had to appeal to the most fundamental source of the American dog population, the family home. The desperate, unusual call went out through a grassroots program aptly named Dogs for Defense. It was a strange, unprecedented, and for many families, a heartbreaking request. The government was asking American citizens, in the name of patriotism and survival, to voluntarily give up their pets. They asked fathers and mothers to walk their family dog, the animal that slept curled up at the foot of their child's bed, the friendly face that greeted them at the door, and sign it over to the Quartermaster Corps of the U.S. Army, knowing deep down that they would likely never see it again. The criteria were specific. The dogs had to be large, robust, and between 1 and 5 years old. They had to be intelligent and possess a stable yet protective temperament. The purest of breeds were accepted, but the Army was pragmatic. They valued intelligence and hardiness over pedigree. In the quiet, tree-lined suburb of Pleasantville, New York, the Wren family, Mr. Edward Wren, his wife, and their children, faced this very choice. Their dog was Chips. He was a handsome, sturdy dog, a true American mutt, a husky shepherd-collie mix whose coat was a practical blend of tawny brown, black, and white. He wasn't a show dog destined for the Westminster Kennel Club. He was intelligent, immensely sturdy, and most notably, he was remarkably and perhaps overly protective. He had a growing reputation in the peaceful neighborhood for being intensely territorial. He would chase the noisy municipal garbage truck down the street, barking a challenge to its very existence. He would snap and snarl at strangers who moved too quickly or unexpectedly near the Wren children in the yard. In the gentle, predictable rhythm of peacetime, Chips was an escalating nuisance, a canine problem that Mr. Wren was struggling to contain. But in the escalating violence and unpredictability of wartime, those very traits, the raw aggression, the unwavering loyalty to his immediate circle, and the potent territorial instinct were suddenly transformed. They were no longer defects, they were the precise raw materials the military needed to forge a soldier. Mr. Edward Wren made the decision. It was undoubtedly an act of profound patriotism, a quiet contribution to the war effort, but it was also perhaps a practical solution to a dog that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage in a tranquil, civil-minded suburb. In August of 1942, the Wrens drove Chips to the local train station. There, amidst the steam and the sad sounds of departure, they said their goodbyes to the dog that had grown up alongside their children. Mr. Wren handed his familiar leather leash to a complete stranger wearing a crisp Army uniform. Chips, confused but obedient, was loaded into a wooden crate. He was just another entry, another number in the relentless, cold logistics of war. He was shipped south to the sprawling new War Dog Training Center in Front Royal, Virginia. This was the processing plant, the military's first ever large-scale canine boot camp. It was where beloved family pets went in and where disciplined, combat-ready soldiers were expected to emerge.
The transformation of Chips at the War Dog Training Center in Front Royal, Virginia was not a gentle process. It was brutal, immediate, and singularly efficient. The military had no interest in creating companions or therapy animals. They wanted, with urgent necessity, instruments of war. The training doctrine was an intense blend of established European military techniques and new experimental American methods. The U.S. military hadn't utilized dogs on this scale since the First World War, and even then, the training was never as specialized or as focused on aggression as this. The military quickly assigned Chips to a handler, a young man named Private John P. Rowell. The bond that is forged between a handler and a war dog is not akin to that of a master and a beloved pet.
It is a symbiotic relationship, a tight, mutually dependent pairing forged in the blistering heat of extreme stress and constant vigilance. Raoul had to become the only person Chips trusted implicitly, the only anchor in his newly chaotic existence. To every other person, regardless of rank, uniform, or demeanor, Chips was meticulously trained to be a loaded gun. He was to be wary, defensive, and ready to act upon a split-second command. The training involved a comprehensive program of desensitization, stripping away the dog's natural fears and replacing them with conditioned responses. Trainers fired high-powered rifles next to the dog's sensitive heads until the dog stopped flinching, until the sound of a gunshot became nothing more than background noise. They exposed them to the thick, acrid smoke of burning material, to the simulated screams of combat, and to the pervasive sharp scent of gunpowder and diesel. Crucially, they were taught a core lesson of war, to distrust and respond aggressively to everyone who wasn't wearing an American uniform, especially in the cover of darkness. The world was now divided into two simple and unmistakable categories: Raoul and the uniform, who meant safety and food, and everyone else, who meant danger. Chips excelled, demonstrating a unique aptitude for the harsh curriculum. The German Shepherd in him provided the powerful drive and focus to work and obey. The Husky contributed a relentless stamina and an indifference to harsh conditions. The Collie in his mix gave him a sharp, almost eerie herding intelligence, which, when translated to combat, meant he possessed an unparalleled ability to track and patrol. He learned how to crawl low and silently beneath taut lines of barbed wire. He was trained to detect the faint, elusive scent of a hidden enemy from hundreds of yards away, a scent indistinguishable to human nostrils. He mastered the command "attack," a single sharp word that unleashed his restrained territorial fury. And, perhaps most vital for a dog of his temperament, he learned the command "out," a word that instantly shut down the aggression and called him back to the controlled side of sanity. The sheer force of the training, the constant repetition, and the intensity of the environment forged a profound, unbreakable reliance on Private Raoul. By early 1943, the Quartermaster Corps considered Chips not merely trained, but combat-ready. He was designated K9 Serial Number 11A, officially assigned to the venerable 3rd Infantry Division, specifically the 30th Infantry Regiment, a unit soon to be baptized by fire in the Mediterranean. Chips and Raoul were shipped across the churning, mine-laden waters of the Atlantic Ocean, descending into the sun-scorched, dusty, and hostile North African theater. This deployment served as the first, if less dramatic, test of his capabilities. Chips was used extensively for high-value sentry duty during the critical Casablanca Conference in January 1943. It stands as a curious, almost surreal historical footnote that while President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill were inside an ornate villa discussing the grand strategies for the fate of the free world, the concept of unconditional surrender, a dog from Pleasantville, New York, was silently pacing the perimeter, ensuring no assassins crept through the dense, dry brush. Chips was not merely guarding the perimeter, he was safeguarding the very alliance that would win the war. Yet, sentry duty, though vital, was not the stage upon which Chips would etch his name into military legend. The Allies were looking north, across the deep blue of the Mediterranean. They were looking at the jagged coastline of Sicily, and Chips was going with them.
July 10, 1943, D-Day in the Mediterranean, Operation Husky. The invasion of Sicily was a massive undertaking, a logistical marvel of ships, men, and material. The 3rd Infantry Division, of which Chips was now an integral four-legged member, was tasked with landing on the southwestern coast near the small fishing town of Licata. The pre-dawn air was heavy and expectant. Landing craft infantry, or LCIs, and personnel carriers approached the dark, unseen shore. The moment the ramp of their LCI slammed down onto the wet, yielding sand, the world for Chips and the men of the 30th Infantry Regiment exploded into violent reality. The entrenched Italian and German forces, knowing this was a key landing site, had fortified the beaches with formidable concrete pillboxes, small low-slung bunkers positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that left no patch of beach untouched. Machine guns, notably the terrifyingly fast German MG-42, raked the shoreline in a continuous, deafening chatter. Mortar shells plummeted from the sky, throwing geysers of wet sand, pulverized rock, and lethal shrapnel into the air, punctuated by the thick, sickening thump of their impact. For a human soldier, this environment is the ultimate definition of terrifying sensory overload. For a dog like Chips, whose hearing is approximately 4 times more acute than a human's and whose world is defined by scent and sound, the sustained, agonizing noise must have been physically painful, an unbearable sonic assault on his senses. Chips and Private Rowell hit the beach. They were immediately, brutally pinned down. There was no effective cover, just the shallow, windswept dunes and the horrifying, unmoving bodies of men who hadn't managed to make it even 10 feet from the landing craft ramp. Rowell, following his training, scrambled to dig a shallow hole, and they crawled forward together, inch by painstaking inch, pressing their faces into the hot, gritty sand. Ahead of them, dominating the immediate sector and preventing any advance, was a single, devastating machine gun nest, cleverly hidden within a converted peasant's hut with a reinforced firing slit. The fire from this position was relentless, a scything stream of bullets. The American soldiers couldn't move up the beach to take the hut, nor could they retreat back to the water. They were trapped, caught fast in a deadly, inescapable kill zone. Rowell and Chips were dug in near a shattered palm tree, the air above them alive with the deadly whine of incoming rounds. The noise was maddeningly deafening. The machine gun hammered away, its rhythmic, mechanical thud, 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 an audible countdown to death. Then the narrative changes. The familiar tension on the leather leash suddenly went slack. According to the official reports Private Rowell filed later and confirmed by other witnesses, Rowell did not give the command for the dog to move. Perhaps the noise was too overwhelming for any audible command to be registered, or perhaps the deep protective instinct that had been meticulously cultivated in Chips simply bypassed the need for human instruction. The dog had been trained to protect his handler and his pack was dying around him. Chips broke away from Rowell. Crucially, he did not run away from the machine gun fire, nor did he search for better cover. He ran directly into it, a dark-furred, low-to-the-ground projectile of fury. Witnesses, their accounts preserved in the military archives, described a streaking blur of fur, too fast and too low to be easily tracked, darting across the smoke-filled, fire-swept sand. The machine gunners in the pillbox, likely a mix of inexperienced Italian conscripts and hardened German support troops, saw a low shape coming fast. Through the swirling smoke and the narrow, restrictive firing slit of the bunker, they probably couldn't identify the shape as a dog at all. They fired, attempting to adjust their aim, but Chips was small, blindingly fast, and moving with an erratic, unpredictable combat rhythm. He covered the open ground in seconds, an 80-pound, unstoppable missile. He hit the low, concrete entrance of the pillbox with a jarring thud.
What precisely transpired inside that cramped, terrifying concrete bunker is a blend of forensic reconstruction derived from physical evidence and the frantic, stunned testimony from the survivors. Chips dove into the dark, enclosed space. Inside, there were 4 Italian soldiers manning the MG-42 machine gun, their focus entirely external, pinned on the advancing Americans. Suddenly, without warning, they were sharing that tiny claustrophobic space with 80 pounds of enraged, highly trained muscle, teeth, and snarls. The change in atmosphere must have been instantaneous, transforming the pillbox from a place of relative safety into a frantic, bloody cage. The firing from the machine gun stopped instantly. The deafening thud, thud, thud replaced by a sudden jarring silence on the beach. Outside, the American soldiers, still pinned down and expecting the worst, waited, their hearts pounding in the momentary vacuum. They heard muffled shouting in Italian, rapid and terrified. They heard the clatter of dropped equipment and the sounds of struggle. And most distinctly, they heard the guttural, raw, blood-curdling snarling of a powerful dog engaged in a life-or-death fight response. It was the sound of primal, unleashed aggression. Moments later, unbelievably, an Italian soldier stumbled backward out of the pillbox entrance. He was covered in dirt, his uniform torn, and his hands were raised above his head in an unmistakable gesture of surrender. He was utterly, viscerally terrified. Behind him came another man, then a third, and finally a fourth. 4 heavily armed enemy soldiers had surrendered to the U.S. Army on that blistering hot Sicilian beach. Their gun, the gun that had stopped an entire company, was silent, the men inside completely overwhelmed by a single determined canine assailant. Private Roll, shocked but acting on instinct, rushed forward, his own rifle now ready. He dragged Chips out of the carnage. The dog was a terrifying sight. He was visibly covered in blood, though most of it appeared to be not his own, and he was still struggling, attempting to lunge back at the cowering, newly surrendered prisoners. Chips had sustained visible wounds. He had a deep, bloody scalp wound, a bullet or a piece of shrapnel had grazed his head, and critically, he had powder burns visible on his muzzle and the side of his face. That last detail, preserved in the official reports, is highly significant. The powder burns meant one of 2 things. Either he had clamped his teeth down on the still hot barrel of the machine gun in the fracas, or he had been so unbelievably close to the muzzle flash when he attacked the gunner that the heat and concussive force had singed his fur. The physical evidence confirmed the impossibility of the story. He had single-handedly, through sheer ferocity and training, neutralized a fortified enemy position. The combat medics, prioritizing the human wounded, treated the American soldiers first. But they did not ignore their 4-legged hero. They cleaned the debris from Chip's wounds and bandaged his head, the makeshift field dressing looking absurdly large on his skull. By that evening, as the surviving elements of the 3rd Infantry Division moved cautiously inland, the story was already spreading down the line, moving from unit to unit like a piece of electrifying, morale-boosting news. It was the story of the dog who took the bunker. In the weeks that followed, the 3rd Infantry Division pushed deep into Sicily's rugged mountainous terrain. Chips, having recovered quickly from his injuries, continued the serve. He walked point on numerous patrols, his senses infinitely more reliable than a human scout's eyes. He successfully alerted his platoon to a German ambush hidden on a treacherous mountain road near a town called Gila, a warning that, according to the after-action reports, saved countless lives. He was no longer a curious 4-legged anomaly. He was more than a mascot. He was an absolutely essential, battle-proven asset to the American advance. His valor on the beach was not an isolated incident. It was the defining moment of a sustained, selfless service.
The story of the dog who charged a machine gun nest had, as all extraordinary combat stories do, reached the highest echelons of command. The commander of the 3rd Infantry Division, Major General Lucian Truscott, a stern and respected officer, heard the full account of Chip's exploit. Truscott, a man who understood that morale and courage came in many forms, made a simple, profound decision. Valor was valor, regardless of the species that exhibited it. On November 19, 1943, in a formal, well-attended ceremony held in the field in Italy, Chips was paraded out. General Truscott bent down, eschewing the normal military stiff formality, and personally pinned the Silver Star, the 3rd highest decoration for valor in the U.S. Army, onto Chip's collar. He was also formally awarded the Purple Heart for his scalp wound and powder burns, marking the first time the United States had acknowledged the combat wounds of a dog in this manner. Following this, he was formally recommended for the even higher Distinguished Service Cross for his unparalleled action against the fortified position. The moment was one of great triumph and celebration. The press, desperate for good news from the front, loved the story. Photos of the wounded, decorated dog were splashed across newspapers back home. The folks in Pleasantville saw the pictures. The Wren family, who had donated their nuisance dog, saw him standing tall and proud alongside generals. It was a perfect, heartwarming, morale-boosting story for the entire nation. And then, the cold, dispassionate machinery of the military bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. awoke.
The War Department reviewed the field reports from the 3rd Infantry Division. They consulted their voluminous regulations and their definitions of military personnel and equipment. The bureaucratic legalists, unable to process the extraordinary nature of the event, rendered a fatal administrative judgment. According to the official policy of the United States Army, a dog was explicitly not a soldier. A dog was, in the stiff, dehumanizing language of the Quartermaster Corps, categorized as quartermaster-issue equipment. A dog was in the same technical category as a jeep, a field radio, an M1 rifle, or a pair of standard-issue binoculars. You do not, the argument went, award a Purple Heart to a jeep that gets blown up by a mine. You do not give a Silver Star to a rifle that fires straight and true. The order came down from the Capitol. Revoke the medals. It was a cold, administrative decision made in the quiet comfort of an office thousands of miles away from the smell of cordite and the reality of machine gun fire. The reaction from the men of the 3rd Infantry Division was immediate and volcanic. They were furious. They had been there. They had seen what the dog did. They knew instinctively that a jeep does not make a conscious decision to charge a fortified position. A jeep does not feel fear, and it certainly does not bleed for its unit. The public outcry was even louder. Letters flooded the War Department in a deluge of patriotic anger. The story of Chips, the suburban pet turned selfless warrior, had touched a deep, contradictory nerve in the American psyche. It highlighted a strange, uncomfortable conflict in how humanity views animals in the context of human conflict. We demand that they act with the highest human virtues, courage, loyalty, sacrifice, and obedience, but we insist on treating them as disposable objects, as property, when the fighting is over and the rules are consulted.
While the bureaucratic administrators in Washington argued about the sanctity of military regulations versus the reality of battlefield valor, Chips was becoming a bona fide celebrity in the smoke-filled European theater. His story had been picked up by correspondents, and it spread throughout the Allied forces. He was so famous that the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces himself, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man who would lead the Allied invasion of Europe, expressed the personal desire to meet the hero dog. This meeting is perhaps the most famous and most revealing anecdote in Chip's entire history, for it serves as the perfect, powerful reminder of what Chips actually was: a weapon, a soldier, and a creature deeply affected by the stress of war. The general, the man managing millions of troops and dictating the movements of vast armies, bent down in a gesture of respect and admiration to pet the legendary dog. He reached out his hand, a human touch intended to honor the animal's service. Chip's reaction was instinctive, immediate, and entirely predictable based on his intense training. Remember the brutal schooling at Front Royale. Chips had been programmed to trust only one person, his handler, Private John P. Roll. He had been taught for over a year that all strangers, especially those who approached quickly or unexpectedly, were immediate threats, targets to be neutralized. He had been living in a constant combat zone for months, surrounded by explosions, the sight of death, and relentless violence. When the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces reached for him, Chips did not see a four-star general. He saw a large, unfamiliar man entering his personal space, reaching for him in a way that violated his conditioned boundaries. Chips snapped. With a speed born of his training, he lunged and nipped Eisenhower sharply on the hand. The general's aides, witnessing the dog bite the most powerful man in the Allied forces, were utterly horrified and froze in terror. In any other context, assaulting a superior officer, especially the Supreme Commander, would have been an immediate, severe court-martial offense, perhaps even carrying a death penalty. But Eisenhower, to his immense credit and deep understanding of the situation, just laughed. A genuine, hearty laugh. He understood immediately the nature of the beast. He reportedly withdrew his hand, examining the small wound, and simply said, "It's entirely my fault. I shouldn't have touched him. He's a combat soldier, not a parlor pet." The incident did not hurt Chip's reputation. If anything, it solidified it. He wasn't a docile prop for photo opportunities. He was a legitimate, highly strung war dog on a hair trigger. He was doing the job he was brutally trained to do even when that job involved an unwitting general.
Chips continued to serve valiantly. He fought his way through the rest of the Italian campaign, through the grueling advance into southern France, and ultimately into the final frozen battles in Germany. He survived the entirety of the European War, a testament to his toughness and the constant vigilance of Private John P. Roll. But when the long, devastating conflict finally drew to a close, a difficult question remained. What happens to a weapon, a trained instrument of aggression, when the declaration of peace is made? Tragically, many war dogs were euthanized at the conclusion of World War II. The military feared, with some justification, that these dogs, trained to be intensely aggressive and distrustful of strangers, could never successfully reintegrate into the complicated, gentle structure of civilian society. They were deemed too dangerous to be released. However, Chip's high public profile, his celebrity status, and the passionate loyalty of the Wren family saved him from this grim fate. The Wrens launched a successful appeal for his return, desperate to have their dog back. The Army agreed to a formal demilitarization process. It was the reverse of his intense training at Front Royal. Chips was taken back to a training center and, with patient effort, was taught how not to be a soldier. He was taught slowly and repeatedly that loud noises didn't automatically signify death. He was taught that strangers weren't necessarily targets. In late 1945, Chips was officially honorably discharged from the United States Army. He was loaded onto a train, not as a piece of cargo, but as a returning hero, headed back to New York. The war was over.
The reunion in Pleasantville was covered by a flurry of media. Flashbulbs popped and cameras clicked, capturing the return of the local hero. But beneath the noisy media circus, it was a quiet, intensely personal moment. The Wren family, standing nervously on the platform, was unsure what to expect. Would this traumatized, hardened war dog, covered in scars and conditioned to aggression, be the same animal they had tearfully signed over 3 years earlier? When Chips was released from his travel crate and saw the familiar faces of the family, his reaction answered the question. The husky collie tail began to wag, a frantic, happy thumping against the ground. He remembered. He settled back into the comforting routine of the Wren home. The family observed subtle but profound changes. He was undoubtedly calmer than the overly territorial dog they had surrendered, but perhaps more subdued, certainly more tired. He bore the mental and physical scars of the Sicilian beach, the Italian mountains, and the German forests. He was an old soul in a young dog's body. Chips lived out the rest of his days as a beloved pet, enjoying the quiet predictability of suburban life he had defended. Sadly, he died of liver failure just 7 short months after returning home in 1946. He was only 6 years old. The relentless stress, the harsh conditions, and the intensity of combat had clearly taken a devastating toll on his young body, even though he had survived the bullets and the shrapnel. Today, if you visit the Hartsdale Pet Cemetery in New York, one of the oldest and most distinguished animal cemeteries in the country, you will find a grave. It is the final resting place of Chips, a small marker that memorializes a giant act of courage. The United States Army, in the years and decades that followed, eventually tried to make amends for the cold administrative injustice of 1943. While they never officially reinstated the specific military medals, during his short life, his story forced a long overdue change in how military working dogs, or MWDs, were viewed and treated. He became the symbolic standard-bearer for the entire Canine Corps. His actions and the subsequent public outcry created the precedent that led to better care, better recognition, and eventually a retirement policy for these brave animals. In 2018, long decades after his death, the British animal charity PDSA, People's Dispensary for Sick Animals, posthumously awarded him the PDSA Dickin Medal, the highest award any animal can receive for military service, an honor often reverently called the Victoria Cross for animals. It was a globally recognized validation of the valor the U.S. Army had officially denied. But the medals, whether stripped or conferred decades late, are just cold metal. The true, enduring legacy of Chips is found in the powerful precedent he set. His single-handed charge on the beach proved beyond any shadow of a bureaucratic doubt that the Canine Corps were not merely equipment. They were complex, sentient participants in the war, capable of spontaneous, selfless courage. When we look back at the grainy black and white footage of World War II, we see the imposing tanks and the roaring aircraft. We read the names of the generals and the
the infantry divisions. But if you look closely at the edges of the historical frame, down near the boots of the advancing soldiers, you might see a low, powerful shape moving through the smoke and the chaos. A German Shepherd Collie mix, head low, ears back, moving not away from the gunfire, but directly towards it. He didn't know about fascism or democracy. He didn't know about the geopolitical map of Europe or the grand strategy of Operation Husky. He only knew, with the raw, simple certainty of his nature, that the men behind him were his pack, and the men in the bunker were hurting them. And for a loyal, brave dog like Chips, that was the only order that ever truly mattered. He charged the machine gun. He saved his pack. He went home.